Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the organization called Save the Children? What is Save the Children doing to help children who are malnourished and other children who may be living in dangerous conditions? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very interesting organization. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at an organization, a very interesting organization called Save the Children, and some of the programs and projects that it has underway. My guest today is an expert on this organization. My guest is Carolyn Miles. Carolyn S. Miles is the president and CEO of Save the Children. Carolyn joined Save the Children in 1998, became CEO and president in 2011. Earlier, she worked in Hong Kong for American Express and is an entrepreneur. Carolyn Miles, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Glad to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump right in it. What exactly is Save the Children? It's been around. I know I've heard about it for years and years and read about it. What exactly is Save the Children? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, it has been around for a long time, as you said. We've been around for over 90 years. The organization was founded in 1919, actually, with the express purpose of helping children after World War I, and particularly orphan children. Started actually by a woman named Eglantine Jebb in the UK. And really, she had some very interesting ideas. The fundamental foundation of the organization is that every child has the right to survive, every child has the right to an education, every child has the right to a happy life. So that really forms the basis for the organization. And we work in 120 countries today.
Now, are you a membership organization? Do you have people can make donations? They can be part of it to get involved in a variety of ways?
Absolutely. We absolutely are an organization that brings people to the issues for children. So, you know, our philosophy is that anybody who cares about these issues for kids can join Save the Children and can donate to the organization, can get involved, can advocate for children. So we have a large organization that's global in scale and scope.
Now, you mentioned you operated in 120 countries. That's quite a wide swath there. That's quite a large number. Do you operate only in the economically developing countries? Do you operate in the United States or developed countries also?
We operate actually in both developed and developing countries. So here in the United States, we work in about 18 states in the U.S., focused in the poorest states in the U.S. and focusing on literacy. And in many, we work in about 30 developed countries and then in about 90 developing or emerging countries. And also both in development and also in emergency response. That's a big part of our work.
Now, if our viewers would like more information on this, they can go to your website?
They can. SaveTheChildren.org is our website, and they can learn a lot about our programs, a lot about how to get involved and engaged in our work.
SaveTheChildren.org, right? In the opening, I mentioned that about malnourishment and also the situation where many children are in very dangerous situations. And what type of program do you have to help kids who maybe are being threatened or who may have violence inflicted upon them or who really are unsafe?
Well, we do a lot of what we call child protection programs, and again, we do those both in emergency settings and in development settings. A good example of our recent work is in Syria, where obviously children are not only targeted during the war, but when they are fleeing the country, they're under a great amount of stress, and so we're working inside the refugee camps, for example, on child protection programs, things that we call child-friendly spaces, for example, places where kids can go to have a safe place to play, they can start to try to recover from some of the trauma that they've undergone in Syria. You know, the stories that kids are telling us about, you know, running basically for their lives from the villages where they've lived all their lives. Lots of trauma there. So those child protection programs are really important. We do work around child labor, which is another protection issue, making sure that, you know, in some countries, it's important to support families that, you know, teenagers, for example, do work, but making sure they have safe conditions, making sure that kids can still go to school. Those are really important things, and we work on that issue as well. It's just a couple examples.
Exactly. And in these conflict zones, it's really sad, it's really tragic that there is violence taking place for any of the participants being involved.
Yeah.
But so often the people who really suffer the most are the people who are the innocent victims,
Yes.
women, children, people who have no involvement in the war and don't want to be involved, but they're still being adversely affected by it. So it's really a tragedy that's taking place in many areas. Now, you've done a wide range of studies, and you have many, and we have one here in particular, and I want to make sure I get the right title here.
Sure.
It's Surviving the First Day, State of the World's Mothers, 2013. And this is the study. What is this about, Surviving the First Day?
Sure. So this is actually a report that we put out every year right around Mother's Day. So it comes out a couple days before Mother's Day. And it's very important for a couple of reasons. It really is trying to raise the awareness of newborn and child survival issues. So many organizations like Save the Children have been working on this issue of child survival. This particular report actually focuses on newborns, and if you look at the number of kids who die under the age of 5, which is the child survival statistic we use, 40% now of those children are newborns. They are dying in that first month. And so this report really looked at that first month and, in fact, that first day. So the majority of kids that die in that first month die the day that they're born. And so this report looks at that. It looks at it by country, looks at the most dangerous place to be a child, to be born, which in this case was Somalia. It looks at the place where, you know, mothers are in danger of their children dying at very high rates. And importantly, it looks at the solutions. So it looks at what can we do about this issue, because there are absolutely inexpensive and relatively easy to scale up solutions here. So they are things like making sure that, you know, every mother has some kind of basic prenatal care, making sure that there are services that mothers can get if the baby is not breathing with some very basic equipment that can be used. So there's a lot of solutions here to the issue. And I did a lot of visiting to countries before this report came out this year. 2 countries specifically. One is Nigeria, where, you know, the Nigerian government has really made a commitment that they don't want their newborns to die. So they have really done a great job at scaling up and rolling out some of these interventions. And then I also visited India, which is sadly the country in the world where the most kids die on the day they're born, over 300,000 children. And so there's 1 million kids worldwide that die on the day that they're born. And I went and visited some of the mothers who had lost their babies in India, for example. And again, lots that we can do about that issue.
And of course, this brings to mind the United Nations Millennium Development Goals were adopted in 2000, and goals 4 and 5 were to reduce infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates. Do you factor those into what you're doing with your report and how you provide services and that type of thing? You look at the Millennium Development Goals. I'm sure you look at all 8 of them, but in this particular case, those 2?
Absolutely. And for Save the Children, Millennium Development Goal 4 is the key goal. That's about child survival. And so for an organization like Save the Children, that's the one we really focus on. And the goal, as you said, was to drive down the mortality rate between 1990 and 2015 by 2/3. And you know, the good news is that we are, in many countries, we have been making great progress, but it's very uneven, and we are not globally going to get to that 2/3 goal by 2015. But we're working very hard now to take the lessons that we've learned over this time period where we really have been able to drive down those deaths of kids under 5, and trying again to make great examples of those countries. Ethiopia is another great example where there's been tremendous progress. but really trying to really push all countries to prioritize, children, and particularly young children, to make sure that they survive. Again, the organization is founded on this idea that every child has the right to survive. So it's a very important part of what we do.
Now, you mentioned lessons learned, and of course there are challenges. I guess they tie into one another. You mentioned that the prenatal care obviously is very important. What are some of the other suggestions that could be made to help mothers either before they have the baby, while they're having the baby, or after they have the baby? This is something we have the wherewithal to do it. It takes some money to do it, but we have the technical knowledge to do it. But again, this is one of the two Millennium Development Goals that are not being achieved quite as quickly as possible. What are some of the lessons learned that will help us to maybe bump those numbers up, or to reduce the numbers, I guess, so there aren't as many infant mortality deaths?
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things that we've been working on in the last couple of years is making sure that every mother and every child has access to basic health care. And that doesn't always mean a clinic or a hospital. In many cases, it doesn't mean a hospital. But making sure that there are trained health workers in those communities, because most of these kids die in remote areas where they don't have access to health care, where the health clinic might be 5 kilometers away. So making sure that there are trained health professionals in that community, and these are not nurses or doctors. These are local women usually that Save the Children and others train to be able to help mothers to be able to understand the danger signs of a difficult pregnancy, to make sure that moms start breastfeeding right away, which is one of the key interventions that will save babies' lives. So really having that knowledgeable health worker in those communities is a huge piece of the work that we've been doing the last couple of years, and it makes a huge difference.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today, we're looking at a very interesting organization, Save the Children, and my guest is someone who's very knowledgeable of Save the Children. Carolyn Miles is the CEO and president of Save the Children. Carolyn, we're talking about what can be done. A lot of the recommendations that you mentioned to help women and to reduce that infant mortality rate, it's very commonsensical. Breastfeeding obviously is commonsensical, and there are so many things that we can do. Do you find that we see that more and more non-governmental organizations, more and more governments, more and more healthcare providers, different ones like this, are becoming more aware of this problem and want to try to help improve the situation and to reduce this problem?
Yes, I mean, I think partnership is a key piece of of how Save the Children works and how you do solve these global issues. And so we work very closely with governments. We demonstrate some programs on the ground that work, and then we try to get governments to take those programs up. We work with UN organizations, we work with the World Bank, we work with corporations who increasingly in the work that we do in development are quite interested in this work. And so it really is going to take all of us saying, these kids don't have to die, and there are things that we can all do about it, and we know what the solutions are. And we just have to get those scaled up. So that's a really important, that idea of partnerships and us doing those things with others is a really important part of how we work.
Now, I mentioned earlier the UN Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in 2000. We were talking about 2 of them, but other goals such as reducing abject poverty, promoting universal primary school education, to promote sustainable development, to develop international cooperation. The deadline is 2015, but the goals are not going to go away per se, or the concept is not going to go away. There will be a 2015 post. Yep. Exactly.
Post
Millennium Development Goals, right, focusing on sustainable development, that broad rubric. Are you involved in that discussion, or is Save the Children? I know a lot of different groups are helping to really lay the foundation for that.
We've actually been very involved in the post-2015 discussions, and as you might suspect, one of our big pushes is to get children into those post-2015 goals. You know, the way I think about this is, you know, if a child that's born in 2015, if those are the right goals, that child born in 2015, if we achieve those goals, that child's future will be much, much brighter. And so we look at it specifically with the child lens, and it's obviously, again, around health and education. I think the other big point on post-2015 goals is the equity issue. The Millennium Development Goals have been terrific in focusing us all, but because they've set these kind of 2/3 goals, or cut this in half, or they have left, frankly, a lot of people behind. And so it's some of the a little bit easier, children to reach that we've been able to reach and drive down those child mortality rates. Now we are really left with some of the hardest to reach kids. And so one of the things we're really pushing on for post-2015 is an equity focus. Make sure that we aren't kind of going to the urban centers that might be easier to deliver, mass change in. Make sure we're going to the furthest places. Make sure that we're going into the slums in the urban areas. Make sure we're really focusing those goals on the hardest to reach. And that, that's the only way to get to the zero goals, which is what we're talking about for post-2015. Let's not talk about 2/3 reduction. Let's talk about no child dying of preventable deaths, right? Let's get to zero.
100%.
That's right.
That's right, success
and
rate.
You've got to focus on equity then.
Exactly. Well, Save the Children's done many interesting studies over the years, and two recent ones deal with food and education. Let's talk about the first one. Is it Food for Thought? Is that the title of that study? What exactly is it, and what were some of the recommendations that came out of the Food for Thought study?
Sure. Well, this study actually looked at the link between malnutrition and learning. And I know here in the United States and in the Western world, there's been a lot of data that shows that first couple years of children's lives are so important in terms of brain development, and food is a key critical issue. And right now, there are 125 million children who are stunted in this world, and that means they have not developed physically or mentally to their capacity because they didn't have enough food to eat. And so this study actually looked at some statistics around those stunted children and looked at the learning outcomes for kids who were stunted, and found that there was tremendous evidence that said that kids who are stunted fall way behind in school. They can't read at the same rates that children who weren't malnourished can. And so if you link that to GDP, there's actually a link to a country's GDP. And so this is an economic development issue. It's not just a human development issue. And again, going back to every child has the right to an education, but it really is an economic issue. And if countries are not able to make sure that kids are getting the nourishment they need in those early years, they are not going to become as productive citizens in that country as they could. And so that's really what that Food for Thought study does.
And of course, that ties right in even to the first study we mentioned, Surviving the First Day, State of the World's Mothers.
That's right.
All of these issues are so interlinked that you just can't dice them and slice them and compartmentalize them. It's so important to view the macro situation.
That's right.
It's been reported, I've seen many articles in the past about how apparently there's a sufficient supply of food in the world right now. We may reach that point if we get to overpopulation. It may not be, but right now there is. But there's a major problem with food distribution. Did you find that to be the case? That in some areas you have too much food, other areas you don't have enough, or if you do have the food, it's not being distributed properly?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, it's that equity issue that we talked about a little bit before. It's getting the food to the people who really need it. A lot of what Save the Children's work is about, particularly in this area of what we call food security, is making sure that families actually can grow enough food for themselves, for taking to market, to make sure that the local food supply is really strong as it can possibly be, to make sure that mothers know the most nutritious food that they can prepare and how to prepare it for their children. So really trying to make families self-sufficient and not depend on food aid, for example, and how can we build that food security. And there's a lot of focus now on making sure that we really work on more productive agriculture, but also incorporating nutrition into that. So it's not just about enough food, it's also about enough nutritious food, especially for children, because going back to that issue of not getting the right nutrition in those early years, if kids are eating and filling their stomachs, but it's not with nutritious food and not the right kinds of food, they also won't develop the right way. So.
Exactly. And if our viewers would like more information, then go to savethechildren.org and get a lot more information about what we're talking about today. We probably won't get through all of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, but when I think of food, it seems to me that obviously sustainable development
Yes.
Millennium Development Goal number 7 ties
Yes.
right into that. And number 1, reduction
Right.
of abject poverty by 50%.
That's
They go hand in hand on this, and it seems that we have to work on these. Now you have programs, do you have anti-poverty programs that
We
you
do.
operate also?
Yep, and I mean the good news on Millennium Development Goal 1 is we have made that goal actually in terms of the number of people who are living at less than $1.25 a day. But 2 things I would say about that goal. First of all, that is a very low bar. And secondly, again, we have equity issues where there still are millions of people who are not reaching not above that level. So I think again we have more work to do. And again, the work that we do around poverty eradication and poverty reduction is really around making families self-sufficient, and it's around livelihoods programs. So how can families make a living? We're very interested in families making a living because most families put that back into their children, which is why we're so focused on it. But that is really what's gonna raise all boats. So.
And you just mentioned indirectly the main link in every family, the female. She is so critical.
That's
and of
right.
course, Millennium Development Goal number 3 is to
Yeah.
empower women.
Yes.
How does that tie into your studies, the programs you operate, and the philosophy of Save the Children to empower women and to make them part of the process and to help them get as many skills, as many resources as possible to deal with these problems?
Well, mothers are critical in our work. I mean, it almost is save the mother, save the child. It is, it's a very critical part of the work that we do. And, mothers are the ones who care. Frankly, they have the most opportunity to care for their children and to change their lives and to develop their lives, especially in the early years. So that's why we write the State of the World's Mothers Report every year around Mother's Day, is to bring forward that link between mothers and the well-being of mothers and the well-being of their children. And in that report, there's an index that actually looks at the status of women and mothers, particularly their access to health care, the mortality rates of women, the economic empowerment of women in countries. And there's a direct link between those things and the survival and the thriving of children. And so really important. Many of our programs on the ground, we're working directly with mothers. The health workers that I talked a little bit before are most often they are mothers in these communities, and they are really the key for us.
Exactly. Now, another report you did dealt with education, and of course, Millennium Development Goal number 2 is to promote universal primary school education. What was your report about, and how does it tie into MDG number 2?
Yes, well, this particular report was called Attacks on Education, and this report comes into play when we think about some of our work in crisis and emergencies. And there were over 3,600 attacks on schools in the past year. Many of those were in places like Syria. Pakistan is obviously Malala, and the attacks that have been happening in Pakistan are a very well-known example. But every day schools are under attack, and particularly girls going to school is still a key critical issue. So this report really does talk about, and it chronicles and documents some of those attacks on school. And again, the right to education is a universal right for children, and the fact that we've got attacks directly on schools, we see as a huge rights issue. So a lot of our work in education is, first of all, making sure that kids have a school to go to. That's the first thing. And then secondly, that when they get to school, they're actually learning. So a lot of our work now is not only making sure kids have schools and that we don't have attacks against schools, et cetera, but making sure that when kids get into school, they have a teacher who has been trained, they have materials and books that the kids actually have access to rather than being locked away in a cupboard somewhere. The kids have what they need to actually learn, because in a lot of places where we work, primary school, 5th or 6th grade is as far as kids go. So if they don't know how to read and they don't know how to write and they don't have those basic skills when they leave primary school, they will never have them. So it's really important to focus on that learning.
Do we find that, or do we see the statistics on attacks on schools and on children too?
Yes.
Do we see that the reporting is better today, or are the numbers going up, or are they coming down, or are we making progress in this area, or is it difficult to evaluate it?
Yeah. It's a little bit hard to tell. I think we've been paying more attention to it, and again, I think there are more glaring examples of attacks on schools now than there have been in the past. But it certainly hasn't gone away as an issue. So it's always been an issue in war, in crisis. Schools are often targeted. People shelter in schools. They become places that people will attack. But I do think that there's been some glaring examples. Syria, as I said, is one big one. There's been over 3,000 attacks in schools in Syria. So.
Now, Carolyn, you made the transition from the private sector to basically a non-governmental organization.
Yes.
You worked in Asia with American Express. You were an entrepreneur. In the last minute or so, how did that Asian experience tie into your interest in trying to help children and to work in this humanitarian initiative as opposed to some other part of the private sector?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me it was two things. One is when I lived and worked in Asia, I think poverty there is extremely evident and very visible. And so seeing that the kind of poverty that you see in places like, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, those kinds of countries, very, very visible. And so that was one impact. The other was I have 3 children. I had 2 of my children when I was there. And we traveled an awful lot across the region, and just the disparity between the opportunities that my children would have and those that I met was, something that really did change my path to go down a different way. And I said, there must be something I can do about closing the gap on those opportunities.
And you have closed the gap. Carolyn Miles, CEO of Save the Children, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.